Marcus Johnson stood on the front lawn of his new home, keys still warm in his hand. The two-story brick house with white trim looked exactly like the pictures online. After years of hard work, he finally owned a home in Oakwood Estates. Home sweet home, Marcus said to himself as he grabbed the first box from his car. The neighborhood was quiet on this Saturday afternoon. Neat lawns, nice cars, and houses that all looked expensive. Marcus had dreamed of living in a place like this since he was a child growing up in a small apartment with his mother. At 35 years old, Marcus was one of the youngest cardiothoracic surgeons in the country. After finishing his training at Johns Hopkins and working for 5 years at Boston Memorial Hospital, he accepted a job as the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Oakwood Medical Center. The new job paid well and gave him the chance to lead his own department. Marcus carried boxes from his car to the house for hours. He had packed his most important things himself, but the moving company would bring the furniture and other boxes tomorrow. He wanted to set up his bedroom and home office first so he could start settling in right away. Across the street, curtains moved in a window. Eleanor Winters, a 62-year-old woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, watched the activity at the Thompson house. The Thompsons had moved to Florida 3 months ago, and the house had been empty since then. "Gerald, come look at this," Eleanor called to her husband. "Someone's at the Thompson place." Gerald Winters, 65, walked slowly to the window. "Probably the new owner, Eleanor. Mary said the house sold last month." Eleanor frowned. "But where's the moving truck? And why is he bringing things in at this hour?" It was nearly 8 p.m. now, and the man across the street was still carrying boxes inside. "Maybe the movers come tomorrow," Gerald said, walking back to his recliner. "Not everyone does things the same way, dear." But Eleanor kept watching. In 30 years of living in Oakwood Estates, she had never seen a black family move in. The man was tall and athletic, wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt. Nothing about him looked suspicious except that he didn't look like her other neighbors, but that was enough for Eleanor. The next day, Marcus woke up early. He made coffee in his new kitchen and stood by the large windows overlooking the backyard. He felt proud. His mother had worked 2 jobs to raise him alone, always telling him education was his way to a better life. She hadn't lived to see him become a doctor, but he knew she would be proud of this moment. The moving truck arrived at 9 a.m. Marcus directed the movers where to place his furniture. By evening, his house was taking shape, though boxes were still everywhere. After the movers left, Marcus worked late into the night, unpacking his medical books and setting up his home office. He needed to review some patient files before starting work on Monday. The lights in his house stayed on past midnight. Eleanor noticed this too. For 3 days, she watched the man coming and going at strange hours. Sometimes he left very early, dressed in nice clothes. Other times he returned late at night. She didn't see any family, just him, and he hadn't come to introduce himself to any neighbors. "That's not how things are done here," she muttered to herself. On the 4th day, after seeing Marcus leave with a backpack at 5:30 a.m. and return with grocery bags at nearly 10 p.m., Eleanor made up her mind. She picked up her phone and dialed the police. "Hello, I'd like to report suspicious activity at 487 Oakwood Drive," she said firmly. "I think someone might be breaking into the Thompson house." Eleanor Winters peeked through her curtains, waiting. 20 minutes after her call, a police car pulled up quietly in front of Marcus's house. No sirens or flashing lights. 2 officers stepped out, a tall Latino man and a shorter Asian woman. "Good," Eleanor whispered to herself. "They're finally doing something about it." Across the street, Marcus had just finished showering after his long day at the hospital. His first day as chief of cardiothoracic surgery had been busy. He met his new team, reviewed upcoming surgeries, and dealt with mountains of paperwork. Now, dressed in sweatpants and a t-shirt, he was heating up a frozen dinner when he heard a firm knock at his front door. Marcus wasn't expecting visitors. He looked through the peephole and was surprised to see 2 police officers standing on his porch. His heart sank. Though he had done nothing wrong, experience had taught him to be careful in these situations. Taking a deep breath, Marcus opened the door with a polite smile. "Good evening, officers. How can I help you?" Officer David Rodriguez spoke first. "Good evening, sir. I'm Officer Rodriguez, and this is Officer Chen. We received a report about possible suspicious activity at this address. Do you live here?" Yes, I do, Marcus replied calmly. I just moved in a few days ago. Is there a problem? Officer Sarah Chen studied his face. May we see some identification, sir? Of course. Marcus kept his movements slow and visible as he reached for his wallet. My driver's license has my old Boston address, but I have my closing documents for the house if you'd like to see those too. The officers looked at his ID. Officer Chen asked, "And what do you do for work, Dr. Johnson?" "I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. Today was actually my first day as department chief at Oakwood Medical Center." Across the street, Eleanor strained to see what was happening. The police were talking to the man for longer than she expected. Why weren't they arresting him? Back at Marcus's door, Officer Rodriguez's tone had softened. "I apologize for the disturbance, Dr. Johnson. We received a call about someone who might be breaking into this home." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. "I see. One of the neighbors thought I was a burglar." "We're required to check out all calls," Officer Chen explained. "But it's clear you belong here. Again, we apologize for the inconvenience." "Would you like to come in and see my papers for the house?" Marcus offered. "I understand you're just doing your job." The officers stepped inside briefly. Marcus showed them his house closing documents and his hospital ID badge. After a quick look, they apologized again and prepared to leave. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Dr. Johnson," Officer Rodriguez said sincerely. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to call the department." After the police left, Marcus sat down heavily on his couch. The frozen dinner in the microwave was forgotten. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, but he had hoped his new neighborhood would be different. From her window, Eleanor watched in confusion as the police left without arresting anyone. The man was still in the Thompson house. What was going on? She saw the officers return to their car and have a brief conversation. Then, to her surprise, Officer Chen looked directly at her house before they drove away. The next morning, Eleanor was pulling weeds in her front garden when she saw the man, dressed in expensive-looking clothes and carrying a leather briefcase, leaving his house. He looked professional and confident, nothing like the suspicious character she had imagined. Curiosity got the better of her. Eleanor straightened up, brushed dirt from her hands, and walked across the street. She would introduce herself and find out what was going on. After all, as the neighborhood watch coordinator for 15 years, it was practically her duty. "Excuse me," she called as Marcus was about to get into his car. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Eleanor Winters from across the street." Marcus turned to face the woman approaching him. Her gray hair was neatly styled, and she wore gardening gloves. He recognized her immediately as the neighbor from across the street, the one who had been watching him since he moved in. "Good morning," Marcus replied politely. "I'm Marcus Johnson. I just moved in last week." Eleanor's smile was stiff. "Welcome to Oakwood Estates. We don't get many new people around here." She looked him up and down, taking in his tailored suit and the expensive watch on his wrist. "What brings you to our neighborhood?" "I accepted a position at Oakwood Medical Center," Marcus said, checking his watch. He didn't want to be late for his morning surgery. "I'm the new chief of cardiothoracic surgery." Eleanor's eyes widened. This was not what she had expected. "You're a doctor?" "Yes, a heart surgeon," Marcus confirmed. He paused, then decided to address the elephant in the room. "Was it you who called the police on me last night, Mrs. Winters?" Eleanor's cheeks turned pink, but she lifted her chin defensively. "Well, you have to understand. No one knew who you were. You were coming and going at strange hours. The neighborhood watch has to be careful." "I see," Marcus said quietly. "And did you call the police on the Wilsons when they moved in last month? Or was there something specific about me that seemed suspicious?" Eleanor fidgeted with her gardening gloves. "Now, that's not fair. I didn't know. That I was a doctor." Marcus finished for her. "Or that I could afford to live here. What exactly made me look like a criminal to you, Mrs. Winters?" Eleanor had no good answer. They both knew what had made her suspicious. Marcus continued, his voice calm but firm. "Do you know how dangerous it can be when someone calls the police on a black man for simply existing in his own home? Those situations don't always end peacefully. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," Eleanor insisted, but her voice had lost its confidence. "From what?" Marcus asked. From me unpacking my books at night after work, from me bringing in groceries, or from me simply being black in what you consider your territory. Eleanor looked down at her feet. No one had ever spoken to her this way before, but she couldn't deny the truth in his words. Last night wasn't the first time something like this has happened to me, Marcus said, softening his tone slightly. I've had security follow me in stores. I've had people cross the street when they see me coming. And yes, I've had the police called on me before. For birdwatching, for waiting for a friend at a coffee shop, for viewing an open house in a nice neighborhood. Eleanor looked up, surprised. But you're a doctor. My white coat doesn't protect me when I'm not wearing it, Marcus replied. My education, my job, my income, none of that changes the color of my skin, which is all some people see. A car drove by, slowing as the driver noticed them talking. Marcus knew he needed to leave for work, but he had one more thing to say. Mrs. Winters, I understand being cautious about strangers, but ask yourself why some strangers make you more nervous than others. I'm your neighbor now. I pay the same property taxes. I want the same safe, peaceful community. The only difference is I have to worry about my own neighbors calling the police on me. Eleanor stood silently, her face flushed with shame. I have to get to the hospital now, Marcus said, checking his watch again. I have a bypass surgery scheduled at 8:30. Perhaps we can continue this conversation another time. As Marcus drove away, Eleanor remained standing on his driveway, stunned by the encounter. For the first time, she was forced to examine her own actions and the assumptions behind them. The neat, orderly world she thought she lived in had suddenly become much more complicated. 2 weeks passed since the confrontation between Marcus and Eleanor. They had not spoken again, though they saw each other occasionally. Marcus would nod politely when their paths crossed, and Eleanor would quickly look away, still uncomfortable with the truth he had spoken. Life in Oakwood Estates returned to its usual rhythm. Marcus settled into his role at the hospital, and Eleanor continued her routine of gardening, book club meetings, and neighborhood watch duties, though she found herself thinking twice before reporting suspicious activity. On a quiet Thursday evening, Eleanor was preparing dinner while her husband Gerald watched TV in the living room. Suddenly, she heard a loud thump and a groan. Gerald, she called out. When there was no answer, she hurried into the living room. Gerald was on the floor, clutching his chest. His face was pale and sweaty, and he was struggling to breathe. Gerald, Eleanor cried, dropping to her knees beside him. What's wrong? Chest. Hurts. Gerald gasped. Can't. Breathe? Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for the phone and dialed 911. My husband is having a heart attack, she told the operator. Please hurry. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes, though it felt like hours to Eleanor. The paramedics worked quickly, hooking Gerald up to machines and loading him into the ambulance. Eleanor climbed in beside him, holding his hand as they sped toward Oakwood Medical Center. At the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed Gerald into the emergency room. Eleanor was asked to wait outside. She paced the waiting area, praying and worrying. After 30 minutes, a young doctor approached her. Mrs. Winters, the doctor said, I'm Dr. Patel. Your husband has suffered a severe heart attack. He needs emergency surgery. Eleanor felt dizzy. Will he be okay? The next few hours are critical, Dr. Patel explained. We've called in our best cardiothoracic surgeon. He's on his way now. Do whatever you need to do, Eleanor pleaded. Just save my Gerald. Dr. Patel nodded. The surgeon will speak with you before the operation. Try to stay calm, Mrs. Winters. Your husband is in good hands. Eleanor sat alone in the waiting room, her mind racing with fear. Gerald had been healthy his whole life. He walked 3 miles every morning. How could this happen? An hour later, a nurse approached. Mrs. Winters, the surgeon would like to speak with you before the operation. Eleanor followed the nurse to a small consultation room. When the door opened, she gasped in shock. Standing there in surgical scrubs was Marcus Johnson. Dr. Johnson will be performing your husband's surgery, the nurse explained, not noticing Eleanor's reaction. Marcus looked equally surprised to see Eleanor, but his professional demeanor didn't change. Mrs. Winters, he said with a nod. Please have a seat. Eleanor sat down, her legs suddenly weak. The man she had called the police on, the man she had suspected of being a criminal, was now going to operate on her husband's heart. "Mrs. Winters," Marcus began, his voice calm and professional. "Your husband has suffered a major heart attack caused by blockages in 3 coronary arteries. He needs immediate bypass surgery." He showed her diagrams and explained the procedure in simple terms. Eleanor barely heard the words. Her mind was spinning with the terrible irony of the situation. Finally, Marcus asked, "Do you have any questions about the procedure?" Eleanor looked up at him, tears filling her eyes. "Will you be able to save him?" she whispered. Marcus met her gaze directly. "I will do everything in my power to give your husband the best possible outcome, Mrs. Winters. That's my job, and I take it very seriously." "I'm sorry," Eleanor blurted out, tears now running down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry for what I did." Marcus nodded once, acknowledging her apology without dwelling on it. "Right now, let's focus on your husband. The surgical team is preparing, and we need to get started." Eleanor wiped her tears and nodded. "Please, save him." "I'll do my best," Marcus promised, standing up. "The surgery will take several hours. The nurses will keep you updated." As Marcus left to prepare for surgery, Eleanor sat alone, facing the consequences of her prejudice in a way she never could have imagined. The waiting room clock seemed to move in slow motion. Eleanor sat alone, clutching a cold cup of coffee. 4 hours had passed since Gerald went into surgery. Every time the door opened, she looked up hopefully, but it was never news about her husband. Other families in the waiting area talked quietly or scrolled through their phones. A young couple received good news and left with relieved smiles. An elderly man was led away by a gentle-voiced doctor, his shoulders slumped with grief. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought about how she and Gerald had met 40 years ago at a school dance. How they had raised 2 children in their house on Oakwood Drive. How Gerald had never judged people the way she did. He would have welcomed Marcus to the neighborhood, she thought with shame. He would have offered to help him move in, not called the police. The waiting room door opened again. This time, Marcus walked in, still wearing his surgical cap. His face showed exhaustion, but his eyes were calm. Eleanor stood up quickly, her heart pounding. "Mrs. Winters," Marcus said, gesturing for her to sit back down. He took the seat beside her. The surgery was successful. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Thank God," she whispered. "And thank you, Dr. Johnson." "Your husband had 3 blocked arteries," Marcus explained. "We performed a triple bypass. The next 48 hours will be critical, but he responded well to the procedure." "Can I see him?" Eleanor asked. "He's in recovery now. A nurse will take you to him soon, but he'll be unconscious from the anesthesia for a few more hours." Eleanor nodded, tears of relief flowing down her cheeks. Marcus handed her a tissue from a nearby box. "Dr. Johnson," Eleanor said after gathering herself, "I don't know what to say, after how I treated you." "You don't need to say anything," Marcus replied. "Your husband needed help. That's why I became a doctor." "But I judged you so unfairly," Eleanor insisted. "I assumed the worst about you based on nothing but your skin color." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Winters, I've been dealing with those assumptions my whole life. From teachers who were surprised when I did well in school. From patients who questioned if I was really their doctor. From police who stopped me for driving my own car." Eleanor listened, really listened, for the first time. "The important thing," Marcus continued, "is that you're willing to recognize it now. Many people never do." A nurse approached them. "Dr. Johnson, Mrs. Wilson in room 302 is asking for you. And Mrs. Winters, I can take you to see your husband now." Marcus stood up. "I'll check on your husband later today. The IQ team will monitor him closely." "Thank you," Eleanor said, looking directly into his eyes. "Not just for saving Gerald, but for being professional despite how poorly I treated you. I was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Marcus nodded. "Get some rest, Mrs. Winters. Gerald will need your strength in the coming days." Eleanor followed the nurse to the recovery room. Gerald lay still, connected to machines that beat steadily. His chest was bandaged, and tubes ran from his body, but he was alive, thanks to the man she had misjudged so terribly. She sat beside her husband's bed and held his hand gently. "Oh, Gerald," she whispered, "we have so much to learn." Later that evening, as Eleanor dozed in the chair by Gerald's bed, she woke to the sound of the door opening. Marcus entered quietly, checking the monitors and examining Gerald's vitals. "How is he doing?" Eleanor asked softly. "Very well," Marcus replied. "His signs are stable." "You came back to check on him yourself," Eleanor observed. Marcus smiled slightly. "I check on all my patients, Mrs. Winters. It's part of providing good care." As he turned to leave, Eleanor said, "Dr. Johnson, my first name is Eleanor." Marcus paused at the door. "Good night, Eleanor. Try to get some sleep. I'll see you in the morning." For the first time since they'd met, Eleanor felt not shame or discomfort, but the beginning of respect. 2 weeks passed. Gerald remained in the hospital, growing stronger each day. Eleanor spent most of her time there, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, going home only to shower and change clothes. Marcus visited every morning during his rounds. He always checked Gerald's incision, listened to his heart, and explained his progress in simple terms. Eleanor watched how gentle his hands were, how carefully he listened to Gerald's questions, and how he always made time despite his busy schedule. "You got a good doctor, Eleanor," Gerald said one afternoon. He was sitting up in bed now, eating real food instead of hospital jello. "Dr. Johnson knows his stuff." Eleanor nodded. "He saved your life." "And he lives across the street?" Gerald asked. "You never mentioned that." Eleanor hadn't told Gerald about calling the police on Marcus or their confrontation. She felt too ashamed. "Yes, he moved in a few weeks ago." "Well, that's convenient," Gerald chuckled. "If my heart acts up again, I can just walk across the street." A nurse entered with Gerald's medication. "You're looking much better, Mr. Winters. Dr. Johnson says you might go home next week if you keep improving." After the nurse left, Eleanor said, "We should invite him over for dinner, once you're stronger." Gerald raised his eyebrows in surprise. Eleanor had never been one to socialize with new neighbors, especially those who were different from their usual friends. "That would be nice," Gerald agreed. "I'd like to thank him properly." On the day of Gerald's discharge, Marcus came to the room with release papers and care instructions. "Remember, Mr. Winters, no driving for 3 weeks. No lifting anything heavier than a gallon of milk. Take short walks every day, but rest when you feel tired." Marcus handed Eleanor a folder. "Here's information about cardiac rehabilitation, his medication schedule, and my direct number if you have any concerns." "Thank you, Dr. Johnson," Gerald said, shaking his hand. "For everything." "Just doing my job," Marcus replied with a smile. "But you did the hard part. Your recovery has been remarkable." As a nurse arrived with a wheelchair for Gerald, Eleanor turned to Marcus. "Dr. Johnson, Marcus, would you join us for dinner once Gerald is feeling up to it? Nothing fancy, just a small thank you." Marcus looked surprised, but nodded. "I'd like that. Give Gerald a couple of weeks to build his strength, and then let me know." Back at home, Gerald settled into his recliner while Eleanor fussed around him, arranging pillows and bringing water. "Eleanor, stop hovering," Gerald said gently. "I'm not made of glass." She sat down on the couch near him. "I almost lost you." "But you didn't," Gerald replied, reaching for her hand. "Thanks to Dr. Johnson." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I need to tell you something, Gerald, about Dr. Johnson and me." She told him everything, watching Marcus move in, calling the police, the confrontation on the driveway. Gerald listened without interrupting, his expression growing serious. "Oh, Eleanor," he said when she finished. "That's not like you." "It is like me," she admitted. "Or it was, but I was wrong, Gerald. So wrong." "Well, you've learned a hard lesson," Gerald said. "But it sounds like you two have started to make peace." "I don't deserve his forgiveness," Eleanor said, wiping away tears. "Maybe not," Gerald replied thoughtfully. "But forgiveness isn't about what we deserve. It's about moving forward. And it sounds like Dr. Johnson is ready to do that." Over the next few weeks, Gerald grew stronger. He took daily walks, first just to the mailbox, then around the block. Eleanor walked beside him, watching for signs of fatigue. One day, they saw Marcus returning home from work. He waved from his driveway. "Dr. Johnson." Gerald called, crossing the street slowly. "How are you?" "I'm well, Mr. Winters. You're looking much better, Marcus replied, smiling at his patient. Feel like joining us for dinner this Friday? Gerald asked. Eleanor makes a fantastic lasagna. Marcus glanced at Eleanor, who nodded hopefully. I'd enjoy that, Marcus said. What time should I come over? As they made dinner plans, Eleanor felt something new begin to grow in place of her old prejudice, the possibility of true neighborliness, maybe even friendship. Friday evening arrived. Eleanor spent the day cleaning the house and preparing dinner. She made her special lasagna with homemade sauce, a fresh salad, and garlic bread. For dessert, she baked an apple pie from her mother's recipe. It's just dinner, Eleanor, not a state visit, Gerald teased as he watched her fuss with the table settings. I want everything to be perfect, Eleanor replied, adjusting the flowers in the centerpiece. This is important. Gerald smiled at his wife. In their 40 years of marriage, he had never seen her so concerned about impressing a neighbor. At exactly 7:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. Eleanor smoothed her dress and took a deep breath before opening the door. Marcus stood on the porch, holding a bottle of wine and a small gift bag. He wore casual clothes, dark jeans, and a blue button-down shirt, but still looked as polished as he did in his doctor's coat. Good evening, he said with a warm smile. Thank you for inviting me. Please, come in, Eleanor replied, stepping aside. Gerald is in the living room. Marcus handed her the wine. I wasn't sure what you preferred, so I brought both red and white. In the living room, Gerald rose carefully from his chair to greet their guest. The two men shook hands. It's good to see you out of the hospital gown, Mr. Winters, Marcus joked. Please call me Gerald, he replied. And I'm happy to be vertical and dressed in real clothes. Marcus handed him the small gift bag, just a little something to help with your recovery. Gerald opened it and found a heart-shaped stress ball and a book titled Heart Health, Your Path to Recovery. The book is excellent, Marcus explained. And the stress ball is not just symbolic. It's good exercise for your hands and arms while you're still taking it easy. Thoughtful of you, Gerald said sincerely. Thank you. Eleanor called them to the dining room, where the table was set with her best dishes and the lasagna steamed in the center. The conversation started slowly, with talk about the unseasonably warm weather and Gerald's progress. But as dinner continued, they relaxed. Marcus told funny stories about medical school, and Gerald shared memories of his years teaching high school math. Eleanor mostly listened. Watching The Easy Way, the two men talked. She had never imagined having a black doctor as a dinner guest in her home, much less enjoying his company so much. During dessert, Marcus said, "This pie is amazing, Eleanor. You're an excellent cook." "Thank you," she replied. "It's my mother's recipe." A comfortable silence fell as they enjoyed the pie. Then Eleanor set down her fork and looked directly at Marcus. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened when you moved in," she said. "Not just about calling the police, but about why I did it." Gerald reached over and squeezed her hand supportively. "I've lived here for 30 years, Eleanor continued. When my children were growing up, this neighborhood was all white families. I never questioned that. I never thought about why." Marcus nodded, but didn't interrupt. "When I saw you moving in, I felt threatened. Not because you did anything threatening, but because you represented change. And I was afraid of that change." Eleanor's voice was steady. "I'm not making excuses. What I did was wrong, but I'm trying to understand it so I can do better." "That's all any of us can do," Marcus said quietly. "Recognize our mistakes and try to grow from them." "The truth is," Eleanor said, "I've missed out on knowing a lot of good people because of my prejudice. I don't want to make that mistake anymore." "Well," Marcus said with a smile, "it's never too late to change. And for what it's worth, I think you're making a good start." As the evening ended, Marcus helped clear the dishes despite Eleanor's protests. At the door, Gerald shook his hand again. "Same time next Friday?" Gerald asked. "I make a mean barbecue." "I'd like that," Marcus replied. "Thank you both for a wonderful evening." Walking back to his house under the stars, Marcus felt hopeful. People could change. He had seen it happen tonight. And sometimes, the most unlikely beginnings led to the most meaningful connections. 6 months passed. Spring turned to summer, and Oakwood Estates bloomed with flowers and activity. Gerald had fully recovered and was back to his morning walks, often joined by Marcus when he wasn't on early hospital duty. Eleanor sat on her front porch, watching kids ride bikes down the street. She smiled at the changes in her neighborhood and in herself. The monthly neighborhood association meeting was being held at Eleanor and Gerald's house tonight. As people arrived, Eleanor welcomed them warmly, including several new families who had recently moved to Oakwood Estates. "Is Dr. Johnson coming?" asked Mrs. Peterson, who lived 2 doors down. "He'll be here," Eleanor replied. "He's finishing his shift at the hospital." As the meeting began in their living room, Gerald called for everyone's attention. "Before we discuss the summer block party, I have something important to say." The room quieted. Gerald stood carefully, still mindful of his chest after the surgery. "Most of you know I had heart surgery 6 months ago," he said. "What you may not know is that our neighbor, Dr. Marcus Johnson, saved my life. But there's more to the story than that." Eleanor nodded at Gerald, encouraging him to continue. "When Marcus first moved in, he wasn't welcomed properly. In fact, someone called the police on him, assuming he was an intruder in his own home." Gerald looked around the room. "That someone was my wife, Eleanor." Murmurs spread through the group. Some people looked shocked, others uncomfortable. "I'm telling you this with Eleanor's permission," Gerald continued. "Not to embarrass her, but because we all need to hear it." Eleanor stood up beside her husband. "I made a terrible mistake," she said clearly. "I judged Marcus based on his skin color, not his character. I was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry for it." Just then, the front door opened and Marcus walked in, still wearing his hospital ID badge. He paused, sensing the tension in the room. "Marcus," Gerald called. "Perfect timing. We were just talking about making Oakwood Estates more welcoming to everyone." Marcus joined them, and Eleanor continued. "I've been the neighborhood watch coordinator for 15 years. I thought I was keeping us safe, but sometimes I was just protecting our comfort with the familiar." She looked directly at Marcus. "Sometimes the people we fear the most are exactly the people we need in our lives." Marcus smiled at her with genuine warmth. Their journey from suspicion to friendship had not been easy, but it was real. "I have a proposal," Eleanor said to the group. "First, I'm stepping down as watch coordinator. And second, I think we should create a welcome committee for new residents, all new residents, to make sure everyone feels at home here." The discussion that followed was lively. Some neighbors shared similar stories of misjudging others. Others talked about feeling unwelcome themselves at times. By the end of the meeting, they had formed not just a welcome committee but also a community diversity group, with Marcus and Eleanor as co-chairs. As people left, Marcus stayed behind to help clean up. "That was brave," he told Eleanor as they washed dishes side by side, "sharing your story with everyone." "It wasn't just my story," Eleanor replied. "It's bigger than that. It's about how we all treat each other." From the living room, Gerald called, "Marcus, are you still coming to the hospital fundraiser with us on Saturday?" "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus answered. "Eleanor promised to introduce me to the hospital board members." Eleanor smiled. When the chief of surgery position had opened at Oakwood Medical Center, she had been the first to recommend Marcus for the permanent role. Later that evening, as Eleanor and Gerald sat on their porch watching the sunset, Gerald took her hand. "You've changed," he said simply. "For the better, I hope," Eleanor replied. "Definitely for the better," Gerald assured her. "And you're changing others too." Across the street, Marcus waved as he left for his evening shift. Eleanor waved back, thinking about how a single moment of prejudice, confronted honestly, had somehow led to this, not just personal growth, but a ripple of change spreading throughout their community. Sometimes the truth, even when painful, was the beginning of something beautiful.